May the words and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Hi, I know you're back there, but the microphone's this way. I'm so glad to be with you all this morning, and so happy to be doing a favor for my friend Julia. So I don't know about you all, but most of the congregations I've ever been part of really slow down in the summer. Yeah, I hear some giggling. Programs slow down. We tend to not have church school in the summer. We do something different with it. Choirs usually take a break, but so glad you're here. Thank you. People are traveling, go see family, that kind of thing. It's just a slow season. And the church itself has a slow season liturgically in the summer. We call this whole time season after Pentecost. It doesn't even really get its own name. It's a very, very long season from the end of May to the end of November. And there's not really a lot of feasts or festivals that land on Sundays. It's just slow, and slow's not bad. Slow is how we get rest and rejuvenation, and there's space for ideas and energy to rebuild. And slow is what God commanded us. We are supposed to be keeping the Sabbath every week because Sabbath is how things grow. The way that our normal summer green liturgic cloths remind us. And that slowness of summer and the time for growth is partly why clergy sabbaticals tend to fall in the summer, like the one you all and Julia are taking as a rest this year. But today, you may notice we're not in green. We are in white, because this is one of the feasts that actually falls in the long, long season. Today is the Feast of the Transfiguration. It's one of the few events that gets a feast in the church, and we just heard the story. This is the day when we remember and give thanks for the revelation of God's glory shining in Jesus Christ, made known to Peter, James, and John on the mountaintop. It's so great we hear it twice a year, actually. You probably heard the story in February. So transfiguration literally means a change in appearance, but it's not like a Halloween costume or a disguise. Because in the story we heard of the transfiguration, Jesus is definitely changed. We get the word from the Greek Bible. But he's also definitely the same. He's both recognizable, they know it's Jesus, and recognizably different. Now, in our story from Exodus, Moses was similarly transfigured by his encounters with God on a mountain. The people knew it was Moses when he came down the mountain, but also knew that he was different. The divine light literally shone from his face so that he had to wear a veil around his people. These stories are actually put together on purpose in the lectionary to remind us of what I have a hunch many of you already know, which is this: experiencing the love of God and the presence of the divine leaves a mark. We can see whether it's something that happens in a moment or something we see in hindsight. The way our lives and our hearts have been shaped to reflect God's glory more fully every time we get to experience that love. The way that the light of Christ changes us might be dramatic and sudden, like the light glaring off Moses' face or the dazzling light Peter, James, and John got to saw because they stayed awake. Or that blinding light that converts Saul into Paul, knocks him off his high horse, literally and figuratively, and helps him become a Christian. Those are the dramatic stories of light. But in this slow season, and in a time of sabbatical, I want us to also remember that light changes us slowly with time and steady exposure. So I have two friends that I've had really great conversations with recently. One, she's a mom, she's got little kids, and one of her kids had a potentially tragic and absolutely miraculous recovery this summer. It was one of those things that in a flash, your whole life changes, and then all of a sudden he's fine. I really have no other word for it besides miraculous. When I talked with her afterwards, she was having a hard time because her prayer life had changed so dramatically. And she couldn't find her footing anymore. And this is a woman, you hopefully know these people. They just radiate their spirituality. She's more prayerful than most people I've ever met. And I'm clergy. She's the kind of person when they say they're going to pray for you, not only does she mean it, but you think it'll work. And this woman watching her son in the ICU and then be miraculously cleared 5 days later couldn't pray anymore. And as we talked on the phone, this was the image that came up. Moses, she called me because I've had little kids too, and say, how do you pray when you have little kids? And I was like, oh, honey, that's not your problem. Your problem is your Moses on the mountain. You are so glowing that you are different. You've been changed by this encounter. Everything will be different now. And she said, oh, that's true. I have very little time for people's smallness. And yeah, I bet. Very suddenly, an experience with intense presence of God has changed her completely. She doesn't know what that means for her yet. And that's okay. She doesn't need to. She'll get there. I have another friend. Deep in COVID in 2020, some of you may have had this unfortunate experience. She lives very far from her family, and her father had one of those instant heart attacks that led to his death. She is a daddy's girl. She's in her 50s, but she's still a daddy's girl. And my friend was so wrecked. She was in the middle of moving house. It was terrible. I hope none of you have experienced that, but I bet some of you have. I visited her with this week as they moved back into that house after some renovation. The anniversary of her dad's death was this week. She didn't notice until 11 o'clock in the morning what day it was. 3 years of prayer, finding her way back to a church that affirmed the same values she actually held, of working with a therapist, getting the help she needed. 3 years, and she could look back and say, this encounter has changed me, and I could see it. Once she knew it was the anniversary, they did some things to celebrate her dad, but it wasn't the way it used to be, because she had prayed and worked and thought and shared and taken some medication to get to a place where the light left its mark. But she was still herself, but she was recognizably different. It is true, with less tragedy and miracle, that sabbatical time is intended to be like that. It is the time of encountering God more deeply than we normally can because we make space for the light. And in that, we're changed. We're the same, and we're different. Coming back together after a time away, Julia and all of you are going to be recognizable, and you will be recognizably different in ways that you might not even notice right away. Like Moses and Jesus and the disciples, this time away allows the light of God to creep in and do its work among you. But you may not have been on the same mountains, and you may be marked differently in that light. But creating space and time away, time in worship, time in nature, which for you all is basically the same thing. How fantastic. Making extra time for prayer. Maybe making extra time for your therapist. All of those things is how the light gets in. And when the light of God comes into those spaces, it will change us into the shining light of the world we are called to be, gradually and suddenly and forever. Summer's also campfire time, and I found this poem from Judy Brown that I love called Fire. Here's what she writes. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and the absence of fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. In this slow season and on this feast day of light, I hope you find a way to follow in the steps of Peter, James, and John and Moses, to go up a mountain and to make some space for the glowing light of God to find its way into our hearts and our lives, that leaves us both recognizable and recognizably different as we carry the love and light of God to the world. Amen.
Amen.